Hello, gardeners, and welcome to another great start to your gardening week and my gardening week. I'm Gardener Scott, and over the next 90 minutes, I'll be throwing out a lot of great gardening information and answering your questions. It's already great to see so many people checking in from all over the world. A few questions have popped up. Let's start this week with some wonderful gardening observations. Mage Gray Wolf saw a first hummingbird in the garden in many years. And it's those kind of things that I always ask you to look for in your garden. It's the simple things like a single hummingbird that can really make your day and make your week. So thank you for sharing that. Last year was my very first year beginning to build my new garden, and this year I had one of those days. It was later in the season, and I heard it first, but there was a hummingbird. Just breezed by, took a break on my arch, sucked on some of my vetch flowers, and then was off. But hummingbirds in the garden are so nice, and I'm definitely going to be focused on attracting hummingbirds in addition to lots of other wildlife in my garden this year. Carla, great way to start the day. Always good to see you. Thank you so much for that super chat. Thank you, Gardener Scott, for being a great facilitator and sharing useful gardening information. As you know, Carla, it is my pleasure. Let's go ahead and get to a question that's already generated some really good discussion on the chat today. And so don't hesitate to ask your questions and don't hesitate to participate in the chat. And this also comes from Mage Gray Wolf wondering about putting tomato plants in compost when they've been infected by a disease. So in this case, it's powdery mildew. And I completely agree with most of the discussion going back and forth that Jay has put out. And I think Rachel made a comment about avoiding diseased plants in your compost. And that's what I typically try to do as well. If you have a hot compost pile, the temperatures can get extremely hot, 160 degrees Fahrenheit, if you really tend to your pile. And that is hot enough to kill spores and any other bacteria, fungi, whatever might be causing the disease. But most of us don't have hot compost piles. We might have warm piles. I have a cool pile, and in that case, those diseases are not going to be killed in your compost pile. So the rule of thumb, yes, is avoid putting diseased material in your compost so that you don't spread it. Now, that being said, as far as powdery mildew is concerned, I give myself a little bit of latitude there. Powdery mildew spores are everywhere. This year in my garden, I grew squash for the very first time in some beds, brand new soil, brand new beds, brand new compost, and I got powdery mildew on some of my plants. It's around you. It's going to happen if the conditions are right. The thing about powdery mildew is it tends to be airborne. It'll land on the leaves and then it'll spread. It's not really going to infect your plant in the soil. And compost is typically amended to the soil. So that's why I say I give myself some latitude. I don't have a lot of material yet to compost, so I did put some of those squash leaves in my compost pile, and I would put some of the tomato plants in my compost pile. The spores are not going to be killed, but they are going to be worked into the soil when that compost is ready, and it will not spread to the plant from the soil. It's going to spread from all the other gardens in my area and wherever the spores are resting when the wind pops up. So powdery mildew is so ubiquitous. It's one of those things almost all of us deal with almost every year. So I'd rather go ahead and use some of that organic material in my compost pile just so I have more compost than to toss it all out. That's one of the very few diseases that I'll compost. So again, rule of thumb, don't compost diseased materials. But powdery mildew, I kind of give a pass on it. So there's my basic philosophy on there. Rachel McGraw was asking a question about strawberries. Right now she has strawberries that are covered. They have some frost protection and wondering, should it stay that way or go uncovered? And I've talked about strawberries in recent live streams. And so I'll go ahead and expand on some of what I've already said. Strawberries are very durable. They can handle really cold conditions. A little bit of mulch in the springtime can help. Late winter is okay, but this time of year, my strawberries are still growing. They're still green, and I've already had temperatures drop down to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about minus 18 Celsius. And the strawberries have come out fine. So most of the time in the winter, I take protection like the hoops and the plastic off of my plants just so the snow can get to it. And in Maryland, you're getting snow right now, so I just as soon have the snow rest on my bed so when it melts, it can go into the soil and help replenish the soil moisture. Maybe some of the bacteria and fungi are still active, and that'll help make for a healthy soil. If you keep your beds covered, if you keep your strawberries covered, you're not allowing that little bit extra part of nature to enrich your bed. So I uncover my strawberries, a little bit of mulch late in winter or early spring, and I just let them live as long as they can. Their roots are still growing. I still water them even when it's so cold. I wait till the days warm up above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and then I'll give them a water just to make sure they're still alive. Thanos, thank you so much for that super chat. Please consider distributing the Q&A in the podcast format as well. It'd be cool to be able to hear older and future Q&A while working on the garden. That's an interesting idea. I'm not sure how to do that. I'll start thinking about that. I do put the time codes for past chats, but haven't thought about a podcast option. So that may be coming some point in the future. Thanks for suggesting that. That's something I hadn't really even considered, listening to some of the old streams. I know a lot of you listen to the current stream as it's happening while you're in the garden, but yeah, that could be a nice option. I'll start thinking about how maybe that could happen. Okay, let's see what we have popping up. Muffy 1981 is saying, I have a small winter garden now closer to my house. This is my first time trying to grow cruciferous veggies. Should I cover them? I have lettuces, radishes, Swiss chard, and beets. It depends on your climate. It depends on your weather. All of those can handle cold conditions below freezing. And so if you are living in an area where the temperature is just below freezing and then goes above freezing, the plants will do fine. But if it drops much below that, past the point, what we call a hard freeze, which is 28 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about minus 2.5 Celsius. When temperatures start dropping below that point, some of those plants can suffer some damage. And so the plant itself might not be killed, but if you're trying to grow it for the leaves, for like in a salad, some of those leaves can be damaged by that amount of cold. In that case, you probably want to put a cover over them, some type of frost protection. And with hoops and plastic, you can gain another 3 to 4, maybe even 5 degrees Fahrenheit of protection, which now means if your temperatures are dropping down into the low 20s Fahrenheit, let's say down to about minus 6 Celsius, a little bit of protection like that can allow you to keep growing all of those plants and keep harvesting. So how cold is your winter? How cold is your area? That's going to determine if you need protection and then how much protection you have down to a certain point. Now, again, because I've already had conditions well below that, I've cleaned up almost all my beds, I've taken all the hoops off, and I'm just preparing for next year, next spring. And I'll actually be talking more about doing some of that garden preparation as we continue. Paul is saying, recently had a cold snap. It killed all the leaves of my sweet potatoes. Should I call it a year for them and dig up the bed? Yeah, I would. The sweet potatoes are pretty durable plants, but once they get zapped by cold, they're going to recover slightly, but then you've probably got more cold coming and it'll be zapped again. So I would go ahead and consider calling it a season on those. And that holds true for all warm season plants. If you've still got peppers or tomatoes or squash, if you're in one of those areas where you're just now being exposed to cold, once they get zapped, you're really going to start seeing degradation of the materials, especially with sweet potatoes. They're going to be taking a lot of that energy. The plant is going to take the energy from the roots to try to rejuvenate itself. Well, it's not going to be able to do that with more cold weather and with the few leaves that probably weren't damaged. So go ahead and dig them up and have a harvest while the material, all that sugar is still in the roots, and you'll have a much more delicious harvest. Let's see. Good to see you, Teddy Bear DIY from South Africa. I know that I have quite a few people from South Africa that watch my videos and the live stream. It's I'd say it every week. It's amazing that we have this gardening community from all over and we can share our questions. I've got questions coming in now from Australia, New Zealand, and South America as well, because it's their springtime moving into summer as the rest of us are in fall moving into winter. And it doesn't matter what time of year you're gardening. Gardening information is gardening information, and it can still work to your benefit. Jennifer is saying, my spinach is coming up wonderfully. Have a plastic hoop over them. Beets are ready to be pulled in a few days. Parsley's green and full still. Lovely. That's great. And that's the wonderful thing about growing the type of plants that can handle cold weather, because you can keep harvesting them. I just went out, I got one more bed, and the carrots are still struggling to survive. They're still green growth even after all the cold. And I've got some beets and I've got some spinach. They're not doing great, but those are hardy plants, and they can actually be a fun little diversion when the cold weather starts setting in. Craig is saying, I was just given a greenhouse for free. That's awesome. It's polycarbonate instead of glass. Would using a gas heater be okay through winter as it's not glass? Polycarbonate is an amazing material. And when I build my greenhouse here in another year or two, I'm going to use polycarbonate. It is virtually indestructible. The 42-foot dome greenhouse that I had at the Galileo Garden School garden was all polycarbonate, and it withheld or held up to severe hailstorms, all kinds of weather damage. It's a great material. And I wouldn't worry at all about heating the inside of the greenhouse just because it's polycarbonate. It's not going to melt. It's not going to crack. It's not going to have any of the problems that you might suspect if you put some type of heater in the greenhouse. Instead, I'm guessing that it's a multi-wall construction. A lot of polycarbonate that's used in greenhouses has at least 2 walls with space in between. So it's got some really great air insulation, which is why it's so effective for greenhouses, for holding in the heat in the cold winter months and giving us that extra time. It can get pretty hot in the summer, so you need to make sure you've got a plan for airflow and for cooling the greenhouse. I used shade cloth in the greenhouse to help cool it down in the summer, but heating it should be no concern in the winter. I wouldn't put the heater right next to the polycarbonate. You might get some discoloring. You might, I think I've seen some examples of how heat right next to the polycarbonate can cause it to kind of glaze over so it's not as clear anymore, but shouldn't be an issue for you at all. Okay. Jennifer is saying, I hope to can the spinach this year. We'll see how my harvest will be. Still early to tell. That's great. I end up eating most of my spinach fresh, and I typically will freeze what I don't use. So I hope the canning works out for you. That's awesome. So this week I wanted to continue the theme. Last week we talked a little bit about planning for your garden, and whatever time of season it is that you do your planning, I think fall is a great time, but there are some things that you should consider. And I talked about that in the video that I did this weekend. So I want to continue the theme, continue the discussion in this live chat as well, and talk about garden preparation. First off, This is one of those things that I think too many of us spend a lot of time thinking about what we're going to grow, how we're going to eat it or preserve it after we harvest. Then we get our seeds, and then we go outside to plant and realize maybe the garden isn't quite up to speed yet. Maybe it is a week or two or a month behind where we want it to be. And so I think it's great to spend the springtime or the fall getting your garden ready long before you ever put seeds or plants in the ground. We've had an amazing warm spell here in Colorado. So yesterday it was almost 63 degrees, I think is what we hit. That's about 17 Celsius. And I was outside almost all day yesterday, building some new beds, moving soil, spreading some wood chip mulch. These are all the kind of things that I can do in December when we have unusually warm condition. Now, when spring comes, I don't have to do those tasks. Those beds are all ready to go. And if you've seen my videos and the previous live chats, soil is key. It's so important. But a lot of those soil organisms take time to break down the organic material in the soil. That's one reason why I like to do a lot of this in fall. If I'm adding the amendments to the soil, if I'm adding mulch on the soil, now I've got many months to go before I'm going to plant anything in those beds. And when I do, the soil is alive. Those organisms are active. There's lots of nutrients. There's lots of food for the organisms. And that all takes place now for me in December. And if I have warm days in January and February and March, I'll do the same thing. So think about the preparation you need to do for your garden. While you're thinking about the seeds, while you're doing your planning, while you're looking forward to next year, you got to get the foundation built. You got to get it ready to go. And that foundation is the soil, it's your garden beds, and it's the space that you're going to be gardening in. So start thinking about some of those type of tasks. A lot of us are collecting leaves at this time of year. So use this time to collect bags of leaves that you'll be using as mulch 5 or 6 months from now. Go ahead and start establishing relationships with your neighbors who will give you grass clippings or leaves or the branches and twigs that you can use to fill the lower half of raised beds that you're building. Now's the time to start thinking about that type of garden preparation. And if it's spring for you and you're moving into the summer, it's the same idea. Start thinking about those plants you're going to be growing in the summer and what can you do right now to prepare those beds. Mulch is probably should be very high on your list. So if you don't have the mulch, start getting the mulch. If you haven't started a compost pile yet, start a compost pile. Those are all things to consider as far as garden preparation and getting yourself ahead of schedule. It's so disheartening when the spring comes and it's warm and you're ready to go out and plant. You got your seeds, you got your plan, and then you realize that you still haven't cleaned up the bed from the previous season. Now you got to pull everything and it just takes too much time. Do it now when there aren't a lot of other gardening tasks at hand, and you'll really find that it'll work to your benefit. Linda Hardwick, thank you for that super chat. On my way to San Diego to help my daughter, I have a layover in the Seattle airport and just want you to know I'm not missing Gardener Scott Live. That is awesome, Linda. I hope you have a great visit to San Diego. Now is a wonderful time to visit San Diego. It's a lot warmer than most of the rest of us are experiencing. So I hope you have a good, safe travel, a nice visit, and I appreciate you listening to me on a day where you're at an airport and other things might be on your mind. So thanks so much, Linda, and I look forward to seeing you back next week and every week. I know you're a regular. It's always good to have you part of the chat. Prepper Chris is saying, I'm jelly. It's been sub 32 degrees Fahrenheit in East Tennessee for weeks. That's cold for Tennessee. And I had relatives that lived in Tennessee for a while. We visited around Christmas time. It's so much colder. My son and I have this conversation all the time. He's in Louisiana. The humidity and the cold, when they put themselves together, make for a terrible situation. Now, my humidity stays dry most of the year, and so I can go outside when it's 32 to 40 degrees and get a full day's work done because the humidity might only be single digits, so it doesn't feel that cold. But I know in a lot of those areas, Tennessee being one of them, the humidity tends to be higher, and you get down to those freezing temperatures, it just feels cold. So I feel your pain, Chris. I hope you can get through it, but you know there's colder days coming. Laura Full, good morning to you. It says, remember to keep enough mulch to cover everything and don't sacrifice your mulched ground just to make a compost pile for posterity. Excellent advice. Excellent advice. Again, it gets back to the soil. You've got to protect your soil. And I talk about this in a few different videos. Uncovered soil is exposed to the radiation of the sun, and that will kill the soil organisms in the top of your soil. And covering it with just a little bit of compost is enough to keep all of your soil life alive. So I completely agree. That's why I say mulch should be, if not at the top of your list, close to the top of your list, because it protects the soil in so many ways. So Lauraful, thanks for throwing that out there. Lauraful's very knowledgeable. I always look forward to the comments in my videos and live streams because as the gardeners go, Lauraful's got some great information. Now, you may have seen, it's been about a month, 5-6 weeks ago, I had a bit of a problem with Jay Dixon, assuming Jay was a man, and in fact, Jay is a woman. So, Lauraful, will you help me out in the comments? I'm assuming you are a woman with the name Lori Full, but I could be wrong. So, I haven't, or I've tried not to direct any gender-specific pronouns in your direction. But if you would, just go ahead and put in a comment if you are male or female or otherwise. I would appreciate that. But I do appreciate your comments and all the information that you share, along with Jay Dixon and Heidi Clark, who I try to point out on a weekly basis. They're the moderators. Also, a lot of great gardening information. So if I can't get to your question, hopefully one of them can. And I agree with just about everything they say. I can't think of anything that those three have ever said in response to a question that I've disagreed with. We might look at it slightly differently, but it's all good information. Okay, Jennifer saying, I started a leaf mulch pile this year. Thanks to me. Appreciate that. I've never even thought about it before. Used to bag and throw them away. Never again. I'm so excited for you. That's one of those things you see people, you see gardeners throwing away good organic material. So Jennifer, I'm so glad you're not doing that anymore. And if you haven't started on that trend, I strongly suggest saving your bags. Now, depending on the size of your garden and your yard, you might not want a bunch of big black plastic bags of leaves sitting around. I say just try to find some back corner where they're not too obvious, because all of that material can be used again in your garden, and it just has so many wonderful benefits. So I hope you do use that. Okay, Lena's saying, I throw compostable material over the entire side of my house and mulched with leaves. Awesome. Again, same idea. Get those organics there. Blessed too. Is there such a thing as buying earthworms for spring gardens, or is it best just to attract them naturally? I think it's best to attract them naturally. You can buy worms. If you buy worms, I suggest you buy worms from a local source. Go to a fishing supply shack where the guy's selling earthworms for fish bait. Those are probably going to be sourced from your area. You can buy some of those and introduce them into your garden as a boost. I do not recommend that you buy vermicomposting worms from another state or another country. And vermicompost is worm bins where you have these worms that eat your kitchen scraps, and I've got videos on that. There are different types of worms. And so the vermicomposting worms are worms that only live in the top few inches of soil, which is great if you have a little bin and you've got some food scraps, and the worms never have to burrow deeper than just a few inches. If you put them in the garden, they will do the same thing. They will live in the top few inches of your soil. And during warm months, that's great. But those worms are very susceptible to colder temperatures and even hotter temperatures. If it gets outside their comfort range, they'll stop eating and they'll even die. And so a lot of the worms that you buy are those type of worms. If you just put organic material into your soil, you don't need to buy any worms at all. They will find your soil. And I've said this in recent live chats where the school garden had terrible soil, was surrounded by concrete buried walls. And as soon as I started putting organic material into those beds, the worms found the beds. So build it and they will come. Put organic material throughout your garden, the worms will find it. One way to enhance that is to mulch everything. If you've got your entire garden, your entire yard, your entire landscape covered by plants or mulch, it makes it so much easier for the worms to crawl through and find all that wonderful material, and they will find your beds. So you can buy it. I don't think it's necessary if you give yourself some time to amend your soil and just allow nature to achieve that balance. So the worms you have in your garden in that case are native to your landscape, which means they will handle your climate and your weather much better than anything that you could buy. Prepper Chris is saying, are night crawlers good worms for the gardens? Oh, absolutely. And so, I've mentioned the different types of worms. Well, night crawlers, there's 3 basic categories of worms based on how deep they live, how deep they burrow. And night crawlers are the 3rd type that burrow very deep. So you've got those vermicomposting worms like the red wrigglers that live very close to the surface. The night crawlers are burrowing very deep. So they're aerating the soil, but they're taking a lot of that organic material. You've seen them. You see their little mounds in your lawn or in your garden. So they'll burrow up through your beds, and then they'll burrow back down deep. Well, as they complete that round trip, they're leaving their castings, and their castings are nutrient rich. That's why if you buy worm castings, you pay a pretty penny for it. Well, night crawlers are taking that organic material that they're eating and then pooping out as castings and just putting that throughout your soil, down quite deep. So they're wonderful for improving the soil. I know people that don't like those little mounds in their grass and they try to kill the night crawlers. I say you should welcome them, especially in your garden. If you see them in your lawn, go out at night with a flashlight. You can pull them out and then throw them into your garden, but they're wonderful for improving the structure of your soil and spreading those nutrients throughout as well. And Torches and Pitchforks says, if you build it, they will come. Absolutely. So it's all about organic material, and earthworms are so incredible. And I know that there are many regions of the world that have worms now, and they weren't native, but many of us have native worms that will benefit our garden. Bishop Lewis says, my broccoli plant bolted because we've had a warm fall. I cut off the main flower head as soon as it started to open. Will the resulting flower heads be edible now that the weather has cooled off? Yeah, they should be. Even if they don't fully form, you can still eat them, and that's definitely an option. Depending on how much time you have, and it can definitely handle some cold conditions. Might not be enough light as we start moving into the deep, dark days of winter, and the days are getting shorter, not as much sun, but you can definitely eat those heads of the flowers before they open. After they open, it's all edible. So I say go for it. Pop Barley says, I haven't found a video about blueberries in your YouTube library. Any plans to make one? Yes, I do have a plan. Now, the reason you haven't seen a video about blueberries in my library is because the soil in my area is 7.0 pH and above. So the soil tends to be neutral or alkaline in my region. And blueberries require a lower pH. They require an acidic soil. So blueberries do not grow well in my region. That's why you haven't seen it in my library. But I am planning a video. I did this at the school garden, and then I retired before the blueberries could fruit, but I'm planning to do it now in my home garden. I will build a bed and acidify the soil specifically for growing blueberries. And loganberries actually is what I had. They like acidic soil too. So at the school garden, I built a bed, acidified the soil using sulfur, and then put in some blueberries and some loganberries. So, or lingonberries, not loganberries, lingonberries. And so that's what I'm planning to do again as I'm expanding my garden and continuing to build. So there will be a blueberry video in the future as I prepare that bed and show you how you can grow blueberries in an area with alkaline soil. And then as they grow, I'll show you all the normal care for blueberries that would be associated with it. So they're coming. It's going to be a little ways in the future. If I can, again, I'm doing as much work as I can this time of year. So if I can get ahead of the game, I'm going to be building that blueberry bed this year and hopefully put some plants in. So keep your fingers crossed. We'll see if it's coming. Music Box Dancer says, when the little onion plants are well rooted, they are okay, safe from night crawlers. Until then, I mulch with grass and leaves. That gives them something to eat. Yeah, and the earthworms are typically not going to be eating live plants. They're eating decaying material that the bacteria have already started to break down. That's the way to keep them happy, is mulching with grass and leaves. That'll keep the bacteria and the fungi happy, and they're the ones that are really creating the food for the night crawler. So good for you. That's exactly what you should be doing. Grace Vassal's asking about carbonized hulls, and I'm not familiar with that. So if you know about using carbonized hulls, go ahead and throw out a response if you have one. And if you can ask more about the question, maybe we might be able to know more about what you're trying to use them for. But that's not something I'm familiar with or that I've used in my garden. Mage Grey Wolf is saying, I'm going to create a cage for the blueberries to protect it from the birds. Always a good idea. If you've got a cage, I've found that bird netting is very effective. So I've used bird netting over my strawberries and my gojies and all those other things that the birds like to eat that I also like to eat. I have a bunch of plants that I don't do that, so the birds can eat the berries away from my garden. A cage is a great idea, but I've just taken bird netting and just thrown it over the plant, and that's often enough to keep the birds off as well without having to build a cage. Totally up to you. Cage can help support the netting as a secondary protection as well. Something to think about. Okay, Greg's also planning on adding some blueberry bushes next to pine trees along the back fence. Good. I hope you have some great success with your blueberry bushes. Okay, Robert is asking, what is the best mulching beds without composting straw or wood chips? Leaves. Those are the big three things I use: straw, wood chips, and leaves. And depending on what the bed is and what you're mulching, you can leave the leaves whole or you can crush up the leaves. Bigger leaves, we're talking like maple leaves, I'd like to crush those up because if you leave those whole, they'll mat and they will often actually keep water from making it to the soil. So big leaves like that, I'll crush up and use as mulch. But smaller leaves, I'll just leave whole and use those as mulch too. I like to mix them with dried grass. I've found that when I mix leaves and grass together, they don't tend to blow away as easily. But organic materials that can handle the wind and protect your soil, like the wood chips, like the straw, like the leaves, those are the big things that I encourage. There are lots of other materials out there. You can use corn cobs, you can use rice husks. There's lots of different materials that are being sold, but I encourage you to use what you have in your landscape or you can get easily, because that's something you're more likely to repeat and more likely to do on a regular basis. Token Trowel says, wish I could do more berries, but we are so alkaline it's not worth the fight. I'm trying goji this year, already in the ground. Try raspberries. Raspberries have done pretty well in my region. I don't have as much success with blackberries, but I've had great success with raspberries, and it's just wonderful. That also had great success with currants. In fact, some years the currants have outproduced pretty much any other perennial plant I've got in my garden. So give currants a try, give raspberries a try. Even in alkaline soil, they can do pretty well. Okay, let's get back to one of the other things I wanted to talk about this week in preparing and planning for your season, and that's seeds. I've talked in recent weeks about get your seeds as early as you can. Don't overbuy so that there's enough for the rest of us when we want to get seeds. But when it comes time to start thinking about what seeds you're going to grow, there's a few rules of thumb that I think you should consider. I definitely consider it. Right off the bat, grow what you're going to eat. And so many gardeners see a pretty picture in a catalog, or they read the seed package and they think, oh, this looks beautiful, I'm going to grow it. And they end up never harvesting it because they're growing a plant that they don't eat. I'm not a big fan of, or I hadn't been a big fan of green beans. And so there were many years I would grow green beans and not eat them because I just didn't like a basic green bean. I would make pickled green beans for my family, but I wouldn't eat green beans. And so it was one of those plants that I used a lot in the compost pile because I just wasn't harvesting it. I liked the way it looked, but I wasn't eating it. When I discovered rattlesnake green beans, I love green beans. Now that's what I grow. So think about what you like to eat and try to start focusing on acquiring those kind of seeds. And if it's something that you're right on the border of, well, then experiment a little bit. That's how I discovered the rattlesnake and dragon tongue. I like dragon tongue beans as well because I started looking at it and thinking, okay, I like growing green beans and they do pretty well, but I don't eat green beans. So maybe I can find a green bean that I will like. And that's when I started spreading beyond the tried and true, and I discovered a couple new things. So focus on that kind of thinking when it comes to your seeds. If there's a tomato that you've grown every single year, keep growing that tomato because there's obviously a reason you're growing it. But go ahead and venture out a little bit more and start thinking about other potential varieties. Let's use Sun Gold tomatoes. Delicious, small, orange, cherry tomato, incredible. Well, what is it about that tomato that makes it so wonderful to grow? Is it the size? Is it the color? It's probably the taste. So now start spreading outside that and maybe grow Sun Sugar or Golden Nugget. Very similar tomatoes, very productive, but different flavors. Slightly different growth patterns. And that's one way to start approaching the way you order your seeds. Don't be too concerned about going with name brand companies. Now, I love name brand companies because you're going to see them in all the supermarkets and all the garden centers. You're going to see Burpee seeds everywhere. But don't think that you have to buy from Burpee to get good seeds. Now, this last year, I bought seeds from the dollar store. I actually got 2 packages for $1. I bought seeds from M.I. Gardener. And I know a lot of you buy from M.I. Gardener too. $1 for a packet. All of the seeds I started last year did fine. I really didn't come across a company or any type of seed that, excuse me, I don't know where that sneeze came from. I didn't come across any company that I felt was producing inferior seed. So don't be afraid of cheap seeds. You might not get as high germination, but you're going to get enough. You might not get the same quantity as some of these other name brands, but you're going to get enough. So think about saving a little bit of money when it comes to seeds. If you can buy some of the tried and true varieties from a company that costs less, well, now you've saved some seed money to be able to buy one of these unique rare seed varieties from a company like Baker Creek, which tends to be more expensive. So bring that into your thought pattern when it comes to what type of seeds you're going to grow. Also, take a good look at your garden space. And that's why I say this is a good time of year to prepare your garden for planting. Almost all of us, I'm guilty of it, I'm guessing you're guilty of it if you've been gardening for a while, buy way more seeds than we need. We buy seeds for plants that we want to grow and we never get around to growing them, either because we're too busy or often in my case, I don't have the space for it. I know I'm going to build a bed, so therefore I buy the seeds for that bed. Well, then if that bed doesn't get built, the seeds are just sitting for another year before I put them in. So take a good hard look at how much space you have and don't go overboard. Just grow what you want to grow and grow what's affordable to grow and only grow what you need to grow. And also start building up a network of gardening friends. I've already traded some seeds with some gardeners I know. I got free seed from them and they got free seed from me. These are the kind of things I encourage you to start in your path to becoming a better gardener. How you're going to get your seeds each year and the factors you're going to use in selecting your seeds. So just a couple thoughts. I've got a video coming up here very soon where I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's one way that you can really save money in gardening, is how you approach it from the smallest point. And that smallest point is the seed. So as you're planning, seeds are important. And what are you going to do when it comes to select your seeds? And go ahead and feel free to share some of your thoughts. What factors do you use in selecting your seeds? Go ahead and share that with all of us so we can see all the different thought processes. I just shared a few of mine with you. What do you do? How do you select your seeds? Okay, let's see. Stephen Luna says, when will your herbicide video post? I think right now is just redoing my program when I'm planning it out, and I think I'm doing a video about straw and herbicides and a lot of the connections, because I really promote the use of straw as a mulch, but there's a lot of concern about herbicide residue on that. And I think yesterday, if I was looking at it, I've got it programmed for the end of February. So end of February, beginning of March is when I'm planning it for right now. That's about the time of year I think many of us are going to be thinking about getting our straw for mulching in the garden season. That's why I've got it targeted at that point. So I can't give you a more specific date, but that's the general time frame I'm expecting that to come out. Heidi says, I bought seeds from different companies this year because of the unique varieties. And like I said, venturing out, trying something new. Heidi's been gardening for a while, always trying new things. And that's a great way to do it. Now, if you do buy seed from the companies like M.I. Gardener or the dollar store, most of those varieties in those seed packets are going to be the bread and butter plants that everybody grows in their garden, because those are the ones that are produced in the huge quantities, and that's why they can afford to offer them at low cost. It's the unique varieties that you're going to have to search out, and you can expect to pay a little bit more, but that's one of the things that makes gardening exciting. The Little Farmer's Farm says, heirloom seeds are good if you intend on saving some for next year. Just let them bolt and run to seed. Absolutely. And that's a great way to save money again. As I'm planning my garden, of course, I'm planning to grow some of the seeds I saved. And I do the exact same thing. I buy heirloom seeds with the intention of saving those seeds at the end of the season and then continuing that variety, if I like it, for many years to come. And occasionally you'll get an heirloom seed, you'll grow it, you won't be as satisfied with the results. Well, you don't have to save those seeds, you just find something else. But if you have a plant that you like growing, save the seed. Heirloom seeds are the way to do that. Heirloom seeds are open pollinated. Open pollinated is the opposite of hybrid. Saving hybrid seeds, you're not going to get the same plant. But if you save an open pollinated seed, you're going to get the same plant. So all heirlooms are open pollinated. Not all open pollinated plants are heirlooms, however. So do look for open pollinated, and that'll give you an idea. There's some seed companies that will actually put OP on their seed packet when it's not an heirloom. And that's an indication to you to know that you can plant that, save the seed, and then just keep growing it for years to come. Laura says, I study the seed descriptions and look for the ones that mention excellent flavor. Good idea. My garden is smallish, so I want it to be productive and as tasty as possible. Great philosophy. If you're going to grow it, you might as well grow something that tastes good. Thanks for sharing that, Laura. Paul says, I've always been a fan of Seed Savers Exchange. Just looking, I get their emails and their gardening information. Just saw another one pop up today suggesting seeds as a holiday gift. And of course, I think getting them from Seed Savers Exchange is an excellent idea as well. They're one of my favorite companies, and I really like their catalog. And speaking of catalogs, how about you? I've been getting catalogs in the mail over the last 2 weeks. I don't remember them coming this early in the past, but they're coming. I'm looking at them. It's so great. And I'll be talking about seeds in a video right after Christmas as I'm looking through the catalogs and giving a little bit about some of what I just touched on, but also what I look for when I'm going through the catalogs and deciding what seeds to start. So Seed Savers Exchange is a good one. Craig says, I use CK horticultural seeds because of the large quantity for a good price. I haven't gotten anything from them. As it will be my first full year, I've bought more varieties than I need just to see what grows. Absolutely, Craig. I like that approach, and that's kind of what I've done in the past. I still do it. I'll buy seeds just to see what grows. I live in a very challenging environment. You know that if you've been watching my videos and been on any of these live streams in the past. Short season, cold winters, hot summers, lots of wind, low humidity. This is a very challenging environment for me as a gardener. And I do that exact same thing. I buy a lot of seeds, and that's a big factor to see what will do good in my garden. There are so many things that so many of you can grow that I can't. And I've tried so many plants over the years that I know other gardeners are growing in other regions, and I try to put them in my garden, and they just don't do well at all. So yes, great reason for getting seeds is just to try to find what works for you in your garden, because that's what it's all about. I can suggest growing raspberries and currants because of my alkaline soil, and I can't say that I've grown blueberries. Same type of thing. You've got to grow what will grow in your soil, in your region, and selecting your seeds for that is a great idea. I like that. Red Pill People says, sounds like my zone. I'm in zone 8 in central Arizona. All kinds of other problems in Arizona. My brother is in southern Arizona. Huge issues. Same basic idea. Just keep trying to find the plants that work best for you, and then once you find them, keep growing all those plants. Mark's wondering what zone I'm in. I'm in zone 5B, and it's one of those things. I'll say goodbye. It looks like Linda and Heidi are checking out, so good to see you. Hope you stay safe for the next week, and we'll see you next week. But back to this question. I'm in zone 5B, though I think next time that the USDA updates their map, I might be in zone 6A because the winters just haven't been as cold as they used to be. And so it's still cold, still gets well below freezing and even below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but 5B officially is the zone that I'm in. Lauraful says, can you use a leaf pile around blueberries to make the soil more acidic or something? Yes and no. It depends on what kind of leaves you have. Once leaves dry, and then once they break down, they lose the acidity that might have been in that fresh leaf. And so one of the amazing things about compost is regardless of what you put into it, after it decomposes, it in almost all cases becomes pH neutral. So you might be able to use some really acidic material to begin, and as they begin to break down, they might lower the pH very, very slightly, but that's not a long-term fix. And even peat moss, and I tried doing that as well. Peat moss is acidic, and if you mix it into your soil, you can drop the pH for a brief period. Because once that begins to break down, the pH lowering effect is completely negated, and that decomposed peat now gets back into a more neutral pH condition. So you almost have to use an acidifier like sulfur to get the soil down to a pH that's manageable. And even that isn't a long-term fix. It requires reapplication on a regular basis. Okay, let's see. PD says, thank you. You're very welcome. Tamara, my brother, who is a blueberry distributor, says all his farms use pine needles in the soil for blueberries. Very common, but if you look at the research, and there's a lot of university research out there that shows that pine needles really don't acidify soil. There might be, again, a short-term impact at the soil surface where the pine needles are beginning to decompose. You might have a lower pH right at the surface. But as far as soil deeper down, even an inch or two deeper, the pine needles are not going to acidify the soil. So I have a video where I talk about myths, and that's one of those myths. And I discuss some of that research. It just doesn't happen. The dried leaves, dried pine needles, and after they decompose, they won't lower the pH. As far as pine needle mulch that Little Farmer's Farm is asking, same basic idea. I will mulch with pine needles mainly because they last a long time before they break down. But I've learned after seeing the research not to use pine needle mulch to change the soil pH. Use it because it's a great mulch, because it's often free and available, and it will improve the soil as it breaks down. But don't use it as a pH changer. It just doesn't work that way. Okay, Heidi's talking to Paper Chris. I've never grown pecans, but I know they need moisture when they are first planted. I've never heard that they did not like full sun. I haven't heard that either. The people or the regions I know, I actually have some family with those kind of trees. They're always in full sun, and they can get to be quite big. So lots of fun for pecans or pecans. Okay, let's see. Jay's also talking to Lena. You're so active, Jay. So great to see you involved with all this. Do a search on Vegetable Garden Calculator to find a lot of results to help you. There's so much out there. I've been looking at, I told you I was looking at doing a video on developing a garden planner. And some of you had suggested that I develop my own garden planner. And I do have my own methods of doing it. But as I look at information about developing a garden planner, there is so much out there. A lot of free software or inexpensive software on garden planning and garden calculators. Share some of your favorites with others. Lots of good information. I like to do things my way that I've developed over time, finding what works and what doesn't work. But especially if you're new to gardening, it's okay to look at some of these other options out there. Some of these websites, some of these software companies that are offering some of this. There's some really good videos. Grow Veg is a British channel with some really good videos, and they sell a garden planner and calculator, and they make the videos to sell their software. It's pretty good software. It's some stuff that you can really do some amazing things with depending on what you're doing in your garden. I think there's a certain size for most gardeners that are starting off small with just a few beds. You probably don't need a lot of expensive software or any expensive planners. But once you get to a certain size and you're trying to expand your gardening knowledge, some of those options are really good and you can really learn a lot from them. Okay, Elena's saying, I decided to grow more determinate tomatoes for my preserving and only one or two indeterminate for salads and snacking. Great idea. And you've hit on exactly why you grow the different types. Determinate tomatoes give you a whole bunch at the same time, which is great for preserving, and the indeterminate give you the tomatoes over the whole season, which is great for snacking and salad. So good for you. That's an awesome idea. Paul C. says the Old Farmer's Almanac has a garden planner. Thanks. I actually often look at the Old Farmer's Almanac site. They've got a lot of good information on there and a lot of free information as well. So I think I was looking at their garden planner recently, and that's a good suggestion. Okay, Little Farmer's Farm is saying, will you be doing potatoes this next year? If so, what type, please? Yes, I will. I'm planning on growing them in containers, and I haven't decided yet. Now, there's a little place in Maine. The name escapes me for a minute. I'll see if I can remember it here. I've ordered potatoes from them before, and I want to try a few different types. So I want to grow a purple potato this year. I'll be growing a russet potato of some type this year, but I haven't completely decided which ones I'm going to grow yet. As I get to that point, you can expect that I'll have a video that discusses the types that I'm growing. There are also determinate and indeterminate potato types. And so I'd like to grow a determinate and an indeterminate at the very least, but I haven't decided on it yet. So more info to follow. And when I do decide, I'll let you know here in the live stream first, because the video probably won't be coming out until I actually start putting them in the bags and start growing them. Barbass, is transplanting asparagus possible? Absolutely. When you buy asparagus from a nursery or an online site, it's going to come as a bare root typically. And that's what you're doing. You're basically transplanting the asparagus that they dug up, and now you're putting it into your garden. It's best to transplant asparagus when it's dormant, which is why you're planting the bare roots that you're buying from a nursery. Wait until the soil can be worked in late winter, early spring, but before the plant starts actively growing, and then dig it up and transplant it to where you want it to go. And the plant probably won't notice much difference. If it was an older plant, you might lose some of the growth in that first year after transplanting, but go for it. It's easy to do and can help you expand your asparagus bed, especially if you got an asparagus bed that might start getting a little overgrown. Okay, Lauraful says asparagus can crown themselves out, so transplanting and thinning out is commonly done. Yep, there you go. Lilash from Israel, hello to you. Glad to see you here on a Monday checking in. That's wonderful. Token Trials asking, what fun new thing are you going to try growing this year? That's a great question, and I've actually been trying to think hard on that because I always try new things. So I've mentioned before, but this year I'll be growing popcorn, and I think I'll be growing a strawberry popcorn, a red kernel popcorn. So that's new for me, that's different, and I've already got the bed picked out and amended. So gets back to garden preparation, looking ahead. So that's one of the new things that I'm planning on growing. There's also some squashes and melons. Baker Creek catalog has some just weird plants, and some of those I think can grow in my area. Now I've tried growing Armenian cucumbers before and they haven't done real well. I've tried growing some other squashes and gourds. They haven't done real well. But I think I'm going to try to grow some new melon types this year and see if I can get a few to grow. So I'm still trying to figure that out. That's why it's been so great that these catalogs have been coming in recent weeks, because I've been able to look through the catalogs and start getting ideas of these things. Most of my focus is going to be on my pollinator garden, growing flowers, growing the plants that attract beneficial insects. But every year I try to grow something new. And I did grow a squash, a scalloped squash this last year. It did pretty well, but I couldn't figure out how to fix it. And so I sliced it and grilled it and fried it, and it was good, but it was smaller than I anticipated it to be. So I think I'll try some more squashes like that and see what they do. Okay, Pat Patrick, hey, thanks for that super chat. I appreciate it. It's always nice to see the contributions and see the participation. Thank you so much. Okay, one other thing I wanted to get to this year was some of the stuff I've already started keying on, which is that initial garden planning. And as I just talked about, one of the ways I do that is through the catalogs. And if you haven't ordered the seed catalogs, do it. If for no other reason, but to start really getting you thinking about your garden planning. And so all these questions are great questions. What am I going to grow? You're asking me? Well, now I'm saying ask yourself that question, because that's the beginning of garden planning. It's all different levels. And so in the video I just did this last weekend, I actually talked about physically planning your garden as far as where you're going to put your beds and developing your soil and figuring out your timing and all of those aspects of garden. But the next phase now becomes the actual plants and how you plan your planting. I love going through the catalogs and getting new ideas, or remembering the old ideas, those plants that I know do well every year, but maybe they're not open pollinated, they're not heirlooms, I'm not saving the seed, so I've got to buy new seed every year. Well, it helps to remind me those are the kind of things that need to be done. You should have your journal, you should be marking these things down in the journal, but you don't always mark everything that needs to be written down. So catalogs are a great way to start. Look through the catalogs to get ideas, and you may come across a plant. Now, one thing, back to the question that was just asked, I'd like to start growing artichokes. Now, artichokes are difficult to grow in my region, but they can be done. I haven't done it before. I'm hoping to develop a bed between now and March, and if I get it done, artichokes are on that list. They've been on my list for years and years. Well, going through the catalogs, again, I see the artichokes. Where it becomes important from a planning perspective, I know that artichokes are difficult to grow. So for me to grow artichokes successfully, I need to make sure that I select the variety that will do best in my garden based on my season. Now, my season tends to run from mid-May to late September. That's not a lot of time. So I need to select varieties of plants that are typically 100 days to harvest or less. There aren't a lot of artichokes that fall into that category. So for me to grow an artichoke, for me to grow popcorn, for me to grow those different types of plants, I need to be focused on choosing a seed that can fit within my growing season. And you need to do the same thing. You need to take a look at your season. Now, if you're in Arizona, you kind of have a flip-flop season because it gets so hot in the summer, you can't be growing a lot of the plants that we're growing. But you can be growing later in the season or earlier in the season. It's the same idea. You have to figure out how much time you have before the temperatures get up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's your growing season. You have to choose the seeds accordingly to fit. Climate's important. You don't need to worry so much about zones. So I'll talk more about hardiness zones in videos to come. And I've mentioned this in recent live streams. Hardiness zones are focused on perennial plants and shrubs and trees. But as far as vegetable garden planting is concerned, You don't need to really even be concerned about what zone you live in. You need to be concerned about your climate and the length of your growing season and what kind of weather conditions you get. And so now, as you're looking through catalogs, as you're talking to other gardeners, as you're watching videos, as you're listening to my live stream, you bring all those factors into play to try to decide what seeds, what plants will do best for you with your climate and your weather. And now's the time to do it. Now's the time to start thinking about it. Don't worry if you make mistakes. I've done this. I still continue to do this. I'll see a seed picture or seed in a catalog with a beautiful picture, and I'm going to give it a try. I'm going to grow it, and I suspect it won't do well in my region, but I'm still going to go ahead and try it. And most of the time it doesn't do well in my region, but I'm still trying it. It's okay to experiment. It's okay to kind of go outside your boundaries, but you do have to identify what those boundaries are in the first place. And now's the time to do it. Okay. Georgia Gardner Kevin says, I'm in South Georgia and garlic should be in the ground by now. I'm going to say probably too late for garlic if you're zone 7 or under. Yeah, and I've actually talked about this in recent weeks as well. If you have cloves, it's not too late. It's better to put them in the ground. You might get some growth. But yes, I agree with you. If you're in zone 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7, you've kind of reached past the ideal point of planting garlic. But if you've got the cloves and just haven't got around to it yet, and you've got the bed ready to go, go ahead and stick them in the ground. You've got nothing to lose. Otherwise, they're going to end up on the compost pile. But yeah, thanks for pointing that out there. Again, it's what can grow at what time of year, and that's a good example. Garlic should be planted ideally in the fall, but that varies based on where you live. For me, I put my garlic in the very first week of October. So it's been in the ground for 2 months already, and it will continue to be in the ground all winter till it pops back up and sprouts in the spring. Okay, Barb says gardening is an ongoing experiment. Oh, definitely. Every day it's a new experiment with new results, which I think is so fun and so exciting. Okay, Red Pill People, garlic's one of the few things javelina won't dig up. That doesn't surprise me, but that's good to know. Javelina is a big wild hog that often wreaks havoc with gardens in places like Texas. So I'm guessing you're probably in that region of the country, but they can destroy a garden in absolutely no time. So I'm glad to hear that the javelinas don't eat garlic. Garlic's just one of those things that so many people can grow. If you get in zone 8 and above, it can be very challenging. You definitely have to pick the right variety to grow in the warmer regions. But for so many of us, garlic is just a good plant all the way around. So Steven's asking, so you can't plant garlic in the spring for harvesting the fall? You can, but here's how garlic works. So when you put a clove in the ground, it will grow into a plant. It's essentially a seed, though it's not a seed. But it's the same idea. You put it in the ground, you water it, it grows. But the clove requires vernalization. It needs cold temperatures to give it the signal to split into new cloves. And it's those new cloves that then expand and form the bulb. So a garlic bulb has a whole bunch of cloves in it. Well, it needs exposure to cold temperatures for that to happen. That being said, you can plant those cloves in the spring. It will grow into a plant and you can harvest it. It's often referred to as new garlic or spring garlic because it's not going to form the big bulb that we're used to. It's going to be more like growing an onion. You can still use it. You can still have all that great garlic flavor. You're just not going to get the big bulb development. You're just going to get a clove that will grow, and then you can chop it or use it however you're going to use it in the kitchen. So yes, you can grow it. And my gardening buddy Jason, who's also a chef, does a lot of that. He plants garlic in spring for the purpose of harvesting the green garlic. And then he uses that in cooking. It's a more subtle flavor than the mature bulb. You can eat the greens just like you would eat the greens of an onion. And that's how he grows garlic from spring to fall. Actually, he doesn't even make it to the fall because he eats it when it's still young and tender, typically in midsummer. So you can do that, but that's the key. You need the cold weather for it to develop multiple cloves and form into a bulb. So let's see, music box dancer. Is that why I get round ones sometimes like a baseball? Yeah, could definitely be. That's all has to do with the cold exposure if you're still asking about garlic. Tamara is saying, going to try to plant my garlic, which is in the fridge in January in the ground in zone 9B. Good for you. We've talked about that, and maybe that's why you're doing it, because we've mentioned that in the stream. If you're growing in one of those warmer regions, and even right now, again, if you have cloves, go ahead and put them in the ground, or if you're in a zone 7, 8, 9, put them in the refrigerator for a month or so, and that will expose them to the cold they need to help form into the bulb as well. So good for you, Tamara. I hope that works out well for you. Prabesh is asking thoughts about releasing these live streams as a podcast. Yeah, and that was asked earlier, and I hadn't thought about that before, but you're the second person today that has suggested that. So I think I might look into that and figure out. I honestly don't know what's involved with setting up a podcast. It may be more work than I've got time for right now. Maybe I'll have to bring somebody on board. Maybe my daughter can help with that, but I'll look into it. No promises, but that may be something in the new year to experiment with. So Robert's asking, can you freeze the clove and plant it in the spring? You can. I think often the refrigerator is enough. Refrigerators should be below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They should be below about 4 degrees Celsius on a normal basis. That should be cold enough. But you could put it in the freezer. That's really not going to hasten it much. A little bit of freezer time and refrigerator time. I'm just hesitant to put seeds and cloves in the freezer because most of our freezers these days have an automatic cycle where they'll warm up and then they'll cool down. They'll warm up and they'll cool down to get that frost-free atmosphere. Well, sometimes that warming and cooling can damage something like a clove. So I'm not a big fan of putting them in a typical home freezer just because of the varying conditions within that freezer. But it's worth a try. The clove can definitely handle that cold, but the refrigerator is usually often all you need. Mealy's mom C says, first time on chat. Well, welcome. I'm glad to have you here. I have a tree that has mealy bugs all over. Can I still use the fallen leaves with mealy bugs in my compost, or is this not a good idea? So many dried leaves. Oh yeah, absolutely use them. And the mealy bugs actually are a great insect for helping leaves and other organic material decompose. That's one of the things they eat, is decomposing organic matter. So by all means, use those leaves, and those mealy bugs will help break down the leaves into a nice compostable material. I did a video recently on making leaf mold. That's all you're doing is decomposing leaves. You can put leaves in a compost pile, same thing, you're decomposing the leaves. So however you use the leaves, they will decompose, and those mealy bugs will help that decomposition. So don't be worried about that at all. They're not spreading disease or typically causing other damage when you're using something like that as a mulch. So go for it. Absolutely go for it. So Emily S. is saying, this isn't exactly a question, but I just recently planted some carrot tops and your video on harvesting the seeds was very helpful. But this is a question. Do all carrot species grow flowers? Yes, so all species will grow the flowers. There will be some hybrid carrots out there that might not grow the flowers that you're expecting. Carrots are biennial. You should expect that it will take 2 seasons for them to set flower. However, if the conditions are extreme, and I actually saw this in my own garden this year, and I had a number of you comment as well. If it gets really dry and really hot, really stressful conditions, a carrot can actually flower in its first season. Now, if you dig up that carrot, you're going to find out the root is virtually non-existent because it was so stressed, it didn't put any energy into root development. It put all of its energy into the flower development. And so that's one of the issues when you plant carrot tops. You'll get a plant. You might not get flower development because there does need to be enough root to support the growth of the flowers and then the transformation of those flowers into seeds. So carrot tops is a great experiment, a great way, especially to show kids that you can grow something in the kitchen that you were going to put in the compost anyway. You might not get the seeds from growing the carrot tops. Just don't be surprised by that. If you want the seeds from carrots, go ahead and grow a full-fledged carrot. Allow that root in the first season to grow to normal size. Keep it in the ground over the winter. And then in the next season, you should get a big, beautiful, lush carrot plant loaded with thousands and thousands of carrot seeds like I show you in that video. Love Always Jasmine's asking, can I grow bok choy from scraps? Yeah, you can. Very similar. You can reroot bok choy. The stalks and the leaves of the bok choy, I know some people have been able to get them to root. I've never tried it. But if you still have that root, the base of the bok choy, same, just like transplanting. You just put it in the ground. And bok choy is a little bit different because if you have that base and then put it in the ground, it'll grow into a plant. You can actually get a whole new bok choy plant if there's enough of that root section remaining when you plant it. So that's one of those cool things. There's a lot of plants like that. Celery is like that as well. You can put the base of a celery plant that you've cut and you'll get a whole new celery plant growing from it. A lot of those type of plants, you can get that. Okay. Heidi Clark is saying Gardener Scott extended his discount on his merchandise. So if you haven't gotten it yet, you still have time. Thank you for pointing that out. I'll go ahead and show that now. I talked about it last week. Through the month of December, if you have any interest in the Garden Scott merchandise, you'll see links to that below. You can go ahead and use this link, the GS 2020, and that'll get you 15% off whatever it is you're buying. So thanks for pointing that out, and it's just a little bit of an opportunity for me to pay all this back to you. So check that out in the links below. You'll also see it in the description below as well. Thanks. Appreciate you bringing that up. And while we're at it, might as well go ahead and say, if you like the show, give a thumbs up. This is one of those things that YouTube likes to see. So if you haven't given a thumbs up yet and you're learning anything in this stream, give me a thumbs up. You know, it helps me get that little bit of warm fuzzy to know that there are people out there willing to take the time to just punch that button below. So thanks so much for that. Okay, let's see what we have popping up. We'll get to the philosophy here in just a minute. Lena Abbey says, I want the one that says, happy soil, happy plants, happy gardener. Good, that's one of my favorites too. I like that one. So I hope you get on and find it and get the color that you like. There's some others out there that I have tried to come up with some nice fun gardening expressions and put them on a shirt. And you can see many of those in my videos. This time of year, I only have a few of the long sleeve and the hoodies. And so if you see me wearing any of those, they typically are just the basic Gardener Scott logo because I haven't put the sayings on some of those long sleeve things. But I'll probably be expanding to that soon. Oh, Jay, yes, thank you for pointing that out. Whose garden is in the photo behind you? So sorry I forgot that. So every week I have a different picture in the background. Sometimes it's my garden, sometimes it's someone else's garden. And today it comes from the Hot Totties, and I really like that name. And so they sent me this picture, husband and wife team. I think it's a beautiful garden. I kind of detected that they were a little concerned. You know, it's a brand new garden. It doesn't look as pretty as some of the pictures I saw, but they shared the picture. And I think this is a fantastic garden. So if you look around, you can see it's new. There's not a lot growing. But just over here, you can see this archway. And those look like a long bean growing up the archway. That's awesome. The whole garden is surrounded by fencing, obviously, to keep pests out. A lot of work involved. The whole ground is mulched. It looks like primarily a pine needle mulch. That's awesome. You can see the hoop they have set up with the hoop house, growing indoor plants, the plants in the background. I think this is an awesome garden, especially for new gardeners that are trying new things in a new space. So give a shout out to the Hot Totties. I think they have done really well with this garden, and thanks for pointing that out, because I normally like to talk about it earlier in the live stream. I'm really impressed with this. There's a lot of work that has gone into this garden, and you should be very proud of your efforts, because it shows that you're caring about gardening, you're taking the time to do it, and that's why I wanted to showcase it today to all of you, that you don't have to have that pretty established garden. Look at my garden. If you look at the videos I have from the last year, you can see the progression in my garden. But I'm working with a bare space that doesn't look pretty most of the time. And I try not to let that affect me, because I know it's going to take time, but I know that the day will come when there's plants everywhere and it's filled with flowers and it's filled with life. But whenever you're starting a new garden, well, it's new and there's nothing there. So try not to be too self-conscious about your garden. All of our gardens are growing and developing and will be better in the future. Just enjoy it for what it is now. And the Hot Totties, that's an awesome garden. I'm so glad to share it. If you've got a garden picture you'd like to share with me, and I mention it in the description below, you can send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, and I'll add it into the queue. And don't worry if you don't think your garden is pretty enough or big enough. Just send it to me with a little story about what you're doing, and I'll be glad to show it, because we all have different levels of gardening ability, and so many of you have just started gardening this year. So I think it's fantastic. Okay, yeah, way to go, Hot Totties. Great results for a beginner. And Stephen's wondering if that's a cattle panel polytunnel. It looks like it's a cattle panel to me. So you can see that these archways right here, those are definitely cattle panels. And so if you look back, you can see the same basic structure underneath the plastic. And so, yes, I think that's almost definitely cattle panels. I love cattle panels in the garden, and they've shown how you can use them very effectively. So I think that's wonderful. So let's get into a little bit about that, because this gets to the philosophy that I wanted to talk about today, as far as a beginner gardener, and who is a gardener, and when you should become a gardener, and do you need something special when it comes to gardening. And anybody can be a gardener. It's as simple as that. Now, I get asked often, and last week I had a few questions during the live stream asking about my background. And so I want to share a little bit about that with you, and then point out to you that sometimes it's the people you don't expect to become gardeners that become gardeners, or you maybe never expected you would become a gardener and you became a gardener. And so my career was in the United States Air Force. I was a pilot, an instructor pilot, a command pilot. I flew the KC-135. That's the air refueling tanker. So big jet, 4 big engines. It's the size of an airliner jet. And we carried hundreds of thousands of pounds of fuel. And we'd fly around and we would refuel other airplanes. So we would refuel fighters and cargo airplanes. That was our job. And I flew all over the world doing that job. I never really imagined in that time doing that job that I would become a gardener, that I would find a passion for gardening. And that's why this whole thing is just so amazing. It's because you never know. And then I came to the Air Force Academy here at Colorado Springs to run the flight operations. And I flew gliders and motorized gliders and other aircraft to train the cadets in their initial flight training. Again, it's one of those things that very stressful, took a lot of time, took a lot of effort. As an instructor pilot, you got to know a lot. You can't be thinking too much about other things when you're in the air teaching someone who's never flown before. But when I got home, I needed to break away from that a little bit because it's extremely stressful. So I started doing a little bit of gardening, and I'd been dabbling in gardening for many years. And so when I say I've been gardening for 30 years, I haven't been an expert gardener for 30 years. I've been gardening for 30 years. So I had a little garden when we lived in Montana, and I had a little garden when we lived in California, and I had a little garden when we lived in Oklahoma, and I had a little garden when we moved to Colorado. And it was a way for me to get out and just relieve some of that stress from having a high demanding job like I did in the Air Force. Well, over time, I wanted to know more and more because I found I was making more and more mistakes. The more you expand your gardening world, the more mistakes you will make. And so you learn from those mistakes. You have to seek out solutions, either through your own experimentation or by watching something like a Gardner Scott video where maybe I'm covering a subject that you'd like to know more about. Regardless of how you get your information, you need to get more information. And so what I found was I was that kind of guy with a job that people didn't think really matched with gardening. But for me, it was a perfect match. And so when I retired from the Air Force after a full career, I was ready to basically be as stress-free as possible. And that's when I went through the Master Gardener course and spent that first year learning as much as possible as I could, and then giving back to the community and volunteering as a Master Gardener instructor for community classes and lots of other efforts, working the help desk, answering gardening questions. That's how I became a gardener. That's how I became a passionate gardener, was not thinking like everyone else thought I should think. There was nobody in my life who said, wow, Scott, you're a great pilot. You're teaching these cadets how to fly. You should be a gardener. That's not the way life works. We all discover gardening through some serendipitous moment that we didn't see coming. And it's up to you to grab it. It's up to you to say, yeah, I really like this. And I have to believe you're already there. As a beginning gardener, you may still have some doubts. As a more experienced gardener, you're still venturing forward, or else you wouldn't be here listening to me on Mondays for 90 minutes talking about gardening. You already have that kernel of interest. You already have that developing passion. The philosophy point for today is don't be hindered by your past. Don't hold yourself back because you think that gardening doesn't match with who you were or who you are. I'm saying gardening is a great match for all of us, regardless of whether you had a high-stress job like me or not. Gardening offers so much to all of us in our everyday lives. And I've talked to a number of gardeners, mostly new gardeners, who just have those doubts because maybe they're embarrassed. They're embarrassed because, like the hot toddies, they didn't think their garden was good enough to showcase to others. And I want to say, yes, it is. Just by being out there, by growing plants, you put yourself so far ahead of so many other people throughout this world because you've taken action. that so many people never take. And you are helping to define yourself in a new way as a gardener. And it'll move you into the future to become even a better person and a better gardener along the way. So anyone can be a gardener. And don't feel constrained because you didn't have a lifetime of gardening. Or maybe your parents didn't garden. My parents didn't garden. Here I am. My grandkids are gardening. My kids are gardening, not nearly to the level I am, but they're developing that interest, partly because here I am with a passion. And they always saw me as, a dad who had other things and was always busy at work. They didn't see me as a gardener. Now that they see me as a gardener, it's piquing their interest. And this is why I say move forward, because you just don't know who you might influence as you expand your gardening world. Don't worry about what other people think about you. Try not to be concerned about your own thoughts and limitations that you've placed on yourself. Move forward as a gardener. Maybe you can get to the point where you'll be like me and talk to others about gardening, help teach others, and just enjoy all the time that I can when I get that opportunity to be out in the garden. So get that planning happening. Get your seeds ordered. Figure out your plants. Order your catalogs. Do all of that kind of stuff now, and that'll help you on the journey as well. It's just one of those things. I just think it's great. I know you guys like gardening, or else you wouldn't be here. I know you have that interest, so just really grow that interest as we move into this new year. And 2021, by all measures, should be so much better than 2020. And I hope gardening becomes a big part of that new year and all of the next growing season to come. So there you have it. I hope that helps. And it's one of those things to put in your bag of tricks when it comes to figuring out what kind of gardener you are. You're a gardener. Just by planting a seed in the ground, it makes you a gardener. What is that going to turn into? It's completely up to you. Thank you so much for being here. Mondays are my favorite time of the week to spend this time with you all, to see the conversations going back and forth, to have all that's happening. And I hope to see you next Monday. I'll continue to be doing the Monday live streams through the holidays. If you're busy, I fully understand. You can always watch it on the replay and see what you're missing. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.